Antrich und Ehre, was ich dir noch angesäche, so bist du sie aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschehen? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. I'm Matt Pegas.
And this is Dan Baltic.
And we are here today with a good friend of mine, a fellow podcaster, Robert Stark, who I think a lot of our audience is probably familiar with. Certainly anyone who follows me knows Robert. We've sort of been connected at the hip since I first came online in like the beginning. It's about actually, my gosh, it could almost be to the day, about a 4-year anniversary of me sort of coming online into this general sphere of the internet. I would say 4 years since I've gotten red-pilled, but maybe that's silly. Put it this way, 4 years ago I discovered Robert's podcast, and that's how I got into all of this. Robert has been a longtime friend of mine. I kind of came up as a co-host on his podcast long before there was this podcast, and I still co-host on Robert's podcast. Robert really introduced me to a lot of people on this corner of the internet, and even if not actually introduced me as like an online friend, he introduced me to a lot of ideas, both in my correspondence with Robert online, but also, and maybe first and foremost, through his podcast, which, for those who don't know, is called The Stark Truth. You can find it at StarkTruthRadio.com.
Yeah. So, Robert Stark, StarkTruthRadio.com, and we're kind of doing like a simulcast. So I've never been on Matt's new podcast, but this will be a simulcast. And then also, Matt, do you want to introduce your co-host, Dan Baltic, because I've never had him on the show.
This is The New Right, but it is also The Stark Truth. This is a simulcast, kind of the way Dan and I have done with Last Things recently. So for members of Robert's audience who don't know Dan, Dan is my co-host on my new podcast, New Right. Co-host / it was his... slash creator. Dan and I came up with...
it was both of us, Matt. Maybe I came up with the title, but I mean, it was our baby to begin with. So I think we were really working on New Right hand in glove from the very beginning.
Right.
And indeed, with you doing all the audio, I wouldn't have a podcast without you. So.
And also, Matt, do you want to introduce your podcast? I guguess before we get to Vaporfornia, do you want to introduce the premise of New Right very briefly?
So New Right is, we gave our little cryptic lead-in, podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. But in layman's terms, it is a podcast about books, and it's a podcast about literature, and it's a podcast about so-called dissident, or as our friend Manuel Marrero prefers to call it, countercultural literature. It's a literary podcast for people who don't fit the traditional mold that you'd find in the traditional publishing world, included but definitely not limited to people with views of a dissident right sort of persuasion, or as you would say on your podcast, Robert, people with sort of radical center or dissident center, or perhaps even alt center type view. It's not a right-wing podcast per se, but it's for people. It's for outsider-lit or countercultural-lit people who write books that, whether it be for political reasons or just personality reasons, would not be able to get them published or talked about through traditional avenues. And as I said, I came up through your podcast, Robert. And, you and your podcast have been a huge part of my online existence. And New Right is it's pretty different than Star Truth Radio for sure. But at the same time, we're I think, it's different pieces of the same pie, so to speak, where it's this, for lack of a better term, dissident sphere. Just as, Robert, you've done interviews going on 10 or 15 years now with people from across the political spectrum who couldn't find a voice, in mainstream, media, shall we say. New Right is basically that as applied to literature, I think is, part of the connection here.
It's for fellow travelers.
Yeah. So I guess I'll introduce the book then. Vaporfornia is it is relevant to a lot of the themes of my Substack article, but it is, to clarify, it is the sequel to my first novel, Journey to Vapor Island, so my second book as an author, and it's a surreal dark comedy, coming-of-age story set in California. Just to give the brief intro, the protagonist graduates from high school and then dealing with his high school trauma and hopes for life. But it's also set in the aftermath of the massacre and the news coverage of that from the first book, Journey to Vapor Island. So he does cross paths with the original anti-hero. And from the first book, Journey to Vapor Island, and the other characters from the book as well. And it's kind of revealed like layers, like peeling an onion. And then there's also, like the first novel, many references that satirize online subcultures, meme culture, memes, and dissident political spheres. I'm not sure if Dan, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the first book, but Matt,
for sure.
I think you have read Journey to Vapor Island. So if you want to contrast Vaporfornia and how they relate and your comparisons to the plot and the subject matter.
So, again, not to just keep in this mode where I keep getting meta and talking about my friendship with you, Robert, but yeah, Journey to Vapor Island is a book that I think that had just come out around the time that we first met online, so there was a lot of buzz surrounding it. Most of it, from my perspective, was positive. It's a hilarious book. Vaporfornia, the new one, and Journey to Vapor Island both are very funny. Of course, there have been naysayers to both books, accusing them of degeneracy, which I guess we'll get to later. But suffice it to say, there was a lot of buzz about this Journey to Vapor Island book when I first came on to the Star Truth. And Journey to Vapor Island is great, as you say. It's really, you could say it's like a frog Twitter or, like a frog Twitter classic.
I think Gio Panicietti was saying, I never knew this, but he was saying that it became a meme on was it like 8chan or 4chan or something like that? I had no idea.
I mean, these aren't really spheres that I cross paths with too much. But, regardless of, and the story with Gio is that he is now a fan of yours, Robert, and a fan of the book and a fan of your art, but he was originally one of these people who was saying, it was degenerate, blah, blah, blah. But regardless of what people were saying about it, the fact of the matter is, it was laden in this meme culture. It was, I feel like now, and we kind of covered on New Right, there's a lot of people.
Well, it captures the zeitgeist of 2017, and this book captures the current zeitgeist.
Sure. So Journey to Vapor Island very much captures that like kind of Trumpian moment. The original cover had Pepe's on it. It was, very much of that zeitgeist. And what I was going to say was, at that time, a lot of people publish novels now. A lot of people know who, like, Delicious Tacos is now and think of him as, there's this guy with all these books. But in the context of late 2016, 2017, even early 2018, there wasn't really a lot of people publishing, literature like this. So it really kind of was maybe ahead of its time, because I think a lot more people, try to get their work out there now. And yeah, again, regardless of what people may or may not have been saying at the time, it captured that zeitgeist really well. It is hilariously funny, and that kind of thing, making an impact the way that Journey to Vapor Island did. And look, we're smallish Twitter accounts here. I'm not saying it is anything that the majority of people would be on their radar, but nevertheless, I think it did make a splash, and I think that kind of thing, outlives. That kind of thing makes your work last. So I all that is to say, Journey to Vapor Island remains a Twitter classic. But I also always say this, and I helped. I'm credited, I believe, as an editor on Vaporfornia, and I wrote the blurb. Like, obviously.
Oh yeah, I clarify on Twitter if anyone finds anything about the book objectionable, that the editor takes full responsibility.
If there's any obscenity trials based on Vaporfornia, it is me who will be going to jail. Me paying the price. Because no good deed of helping Robert Stark out goes unpunished. I'm just kidding, but I like Vaporfornia more. I think that Journey to Vapor Island is a classic, but I think that Vaporfornia, as you've even said, Robert, not that it's autobiographical per se, but it is more personal. It's a little more introspective in parts, especially perhaps the first half to 3/4 of the novel. And I think, as funny as Journey to Vapor Island is, Vaporfornia kind of finds a balance of some of the sort of more cartoonish style of Journey to Vapor Island, but also I think becomes a lot more of a sort of personal, not memoir, but personal and emotional story that sort of like my novel and sort of like some other, classic.
Yeah, so I think it was Rich Hauk on Twitter who described the first book as having a fever dream, and also I think James O'Meara compared in a review to William Rose. So both of them are very focused on how the protagonist perceives the world, and but the second book, it's more introspective, but you also feel both books are fairly surreal. It's hard to, because I'm speaking as the author, like I'd rather hear someone else who's read it give their take, but it's more intimate as far as feeling deeper in the characters, like inner dialogue and a subconscious.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really curious to let Dan comment, because I actually haven't talked to Dan that much about it since he read Vaporfornia. But yeah, I just think that it speaks to, Journey to Vapor Island, great book, made a splash. There's a lot of shock value to it. And I think you'd really honed your craft as a writer and been better able to sort of tap into that more personal level of writing. But in terms of the overall style, I mean, I don't know, Dan, what was your general take if you had to make comps?
So yeah, I would say it's kind of a picaresque story of this, protagonist, Max von Mueller, who is embroiled in a world that is very unique, but reflects contemporary California and national politics. And he is on this kind of rollicking comic adventure. And if I had to give comparisons, I would say flavors of A Confederacy of Dunces, flavors
of...
Oh,
yeah, I confess that I've never actually read Confederacies of Dunces, but I will have to now. And I got that comparison with the first novel. So Dan, go ahead. Besides Confederacy of Dunces, which other comparisons?
So there's a novel, Lucky Jim, which is kind of also about a hapless protagonist who finds himself, in that case, he's embroiled in the world of university politics in the 1950s. And it's a satire as well. I think, you probably would consider, I would consider Vaporfornia a bit of a satire. So it kind of, it's in that tradition of satires that are also kind of adventure stories that take you through, different places and different, environments, and reflect back on the times, and cast a comic lens, a satirical eye on the times in which we currently live.
Right. And I'd actually never really had that thought about Robert's work, but Robert, you do always say that you like to write novels and stories that, they're never set in one location. You go from place to place to place.
Oh yeah, that has to be. I always bring this up, like with movies, plays, literature. I always get bored if it's everything is in one geographic location. The constant movement, that does kind of, I guess I don't want to say it's autobiographical, but I will say it does reflect my psychological instincts as I crave like constant sense of motion. then also like the physical graphic descriptions of the geographic locations.
Yeah, well,
That's
you're a
crucial.
great lover of architecture and place, which we'll get into, and Vaporfornia basically covers the not all of California, but pretty much the gamut of major California locations.
Well, most of it, I'd say not all of California, but the most important places.
No disrespect to I guess Northern California, but you take us from the Bay Area through the Central Valley. You actually dip into Nevada a little bit, Carson City and Reno, and then we go down to LA, and there's a whole Hollywood kind of section that takes up the last bit of the book. But I say all this to say, in Journey to Vapor Island 2, you have a lot. That one is set actually on the East Coast. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, I've never been to the East Coast. So that book was all from research and imagination. With California, I know a lot of these places pretty much like the back of my hand. So I could write from experience. And also, like, we've taken a trip to the Bay Area, and you could probably see similarities of places that we've traveled to. And it is based on, like, parts of it almost sound like a travel story in sections. But yeah, that was different with the first book, purely from imagination. But yeah, it is very much a book about California, and I would actually estimate that I'm sure there's maybe like been some kind of woke novels about this, but I would say that it's groundbreaking as far as being the first fiction novel that really dives deep into California's social, political, demographics.
We'll get to
dynamics.
California in a second because it's hugely relevant, and as you said, we have a lot of the places in the book are places that literally you and I, Robert, have been together, which is pretty cool. But the last thing I wanted to say about that is just on Dan's thought. The notion of the satire, like the moving satire. That is kind of like this weird niche genre. I'm not sure which examples you had in mind, Dan, but I think of even something like Voltaire's Candide to an extent. Definitely Gulliver's Travels, which is actually the I don't know if you've read that, Robert. I don't know if you've read that, Dan. But I actually wrote my.
I'm familiar with it.
It also reminds me of, I remember with my first book, I remember Brandon Adamson in his review, he described it as an adult version of the Neverending Story.
Yeah. So there's that kind of fantastical element, and again, it's hard to almost put your finger on, but that sense of the story being in motion and kind of going to different places, and different places reflecting differently on society. It is kind of this interesting micro genre of satire, and I would say that Vaporfornia and Journey to Vapor Island both really fit into that. But to touch on the California angle, Vaporfornia, naturally, California is right in the title. Robert, you are a lifelong California resident. My personal angle here is that I have lived in California since 2017, and not only, as I kind of said earlier, has Robert really guided me, and initiated me into a lot of these kind of online circles. A lot of places in California, very, very notable places, and even sort of on a smaller scale, places within LA. Because Robert, you did. I won't say where you live now if you don't want me to, but you grew up in LA. Basically.
Yeah. And also, I gotta clarify is with the Bay Area depictions are fairly accurate, and as an LA native, like viewing the Bay Area as a place going on vacation, the protagonist, he grows up in the Bay Area, and those depictions are pretty accurate as it is. But with LA, actually, I would say a lot of it is based upon fictional locations.
That's a good point. And that kind of ties in a little bit to the different sections of the novel. I mean, you have the first half of it or so takes place in the Bay Area, moving to Modesto, California, and then Max, our protagonist, ends up in LA. The LA part is very futuristic. It involves, and we'll get into some of this later, but it involves buildings created by the sort of heroic figure in the novel, Roger Blackstone. There's this interesting, it's an LA of the future, whereas the Bay Area sections, and certainly Modesto, are sort of those areas of the present. And that kind of ties into a change in tone that happens in the novel, because the first half or so, it is kind of this introspective, I won't call it an incel narrative per se, but it's this narrative about a kind of down on his luck protagonist who's kind of feeling the weight of all these issues and social isolation. And then the second half, which we'll get into a bit more later, but the second half, there's this kind of explosion of, chaotic and crazy things that happen. And that sort of ties into the more imaginative element.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And yeah, like how California, a lot of allegories, but the sense of place is important. And also how California can serve as a symbol, as an allegory, the Lost California Dream, California as the simulation, as it is portrayed in Hollywood, social media, and VR. How Californians are just avatars in this simulation, and Vaporfornia as a parallel California that could exist on an alternative time dimension or an alternative timeline, and then sort of a call for Californians to kind of reclaim their lost destiny and demand the future that was stolen from them. But Vaporfornia, it can be a state of mind. It can be an alternative California that exists in theory. It could be that's kind of like the term is open to interpretation and reference to the whole vapor. There's a whole other allegory to the vapor as well, which is referenced in the first book, and then obviously like the vaporwave genre.
Well, I'm on the podcast you did with Greg Johnson recently. He asked you what the vapor was, and I thought that was an interesting question. I think you sort of answered it just now, but yeah, what in a nutshell? And I know that the answer is it's open for interpretation, but how would you define the notion of the vapor as a realm in the sort of mythology or in the world of your books?
Yeah, again, it's open to interpretation, so it could be interpreted as another dimension and a supernatural component, as the subconscious. It could symbolize like lost futures, the dreams and realities, like what we're missing out on, and the kind of the VR angle, and a lot of different allegories. And then also I think someone on Twitter, they are Portuguese, like they didn't read the book, but they did say in review that it reminds them in a lot of the deeper meaning of the word, I don't know how to pronounce it, saudade in Portuguese culture, not just longing for something or someone, but longing for what could have been, something in a near hypnagogic state, and how you are kind of you kind of sense that, but you can't touch nor partake. And the vapor could definitely symbolize that.
Yeah. I mean,
now, as I was reading it, I thought naturally the vapor being a sort of alternative realm, a sort of ephemeral realm, and it drew a connection in my mind to the current attempts to put over this idea of the metaverse. And what do you think about that, Robert?
I wrote that before. I wrote this before the metaverse was announced. But yeah, VR plays a huge role in the book. Yeah. Being kind of proposed, and also we'll probably get to Roger Blackstone later, the presidential candidate, but he proposes like an aesthetic-based kind of utopia and like the freedom to live in the kind of society you desire. And then there's this alternative. The alternative proposes the VR, and the Hollywood angle is connected to that, but VR is kind of proposed as escapism. So it's kind of like it's kind of presented as like a false option to kind of pacify these desires and keep people pacified. But then it is also heavily linked to the fictional show, and to the realm of the vapor. Like there is some connection, which is a bit vague how they're connected.
So yeah, I thought this was like very on the nose for what is going on right now with the metaverse, because like if the take on the right, and or not just even on the right, seems to be that this is, yes, an attempt to pacify the normies who see declining standards of living. So yeah, like there's the memes going around of like hobos wearing VR goggles, and it naturally, as I'm reading Vaporfornia, I'm like, wow, Robert was he saw this coming before it was announced.
Yeah, so Dan, you haven't even gone into the second half, but Matt, do you know the part I'm talking about where there's the different campaign ads about the future, and they deal with that, and then there's the vision where Max has this weird like hallucination type vision, and then he sees the villain, the director Ari Meshel, speaking with some politician, and they're discussing like the living, like eating bugs, like eating soylent, living in pods, and how we'll give them what we want, but it won't be fake. Like you remember that? You're familiar with that?
Yeah, that
scene.
Was that's integral to sort of the final act in the book, so to speak. It moves us from this narrative about Max as an isolated individual with his troubles to a plot that has sort of almost taps into a little bit of sci-fi thriller at times almost, and a plot that has political ramifications.
I think you said even
it
Black
is Black Mirror-esque. But what was I going to say? Basically that to go back to the idea of what is the vapor. The answer is that it's open for interpretation, but it is ambiguous. There's sort of this positive meaning embodied by the campaign of Roger Blackstone, which, again, we'll get into in a little more depth later. But basically this notion of, the vaporwave, the sort of politicization of vaporwave of it all, the nostalgia for lost futures, the homesickness for a place that you're not sure if it exists. There's a sort of, I would say, positive political element where it's like, how can we, make a better world, make a more aesthetically pleasing world, or to put it in a sort of, quasi-distributist or third position or Blackstonian, or shall we even say Starkian framework, how can we increase, access to beauty? I think that's kind of the concern that animates both Blackstone's campaign in the novel as well as a lot of the protagonist Max's concerns, and you yourselves.
Oh yeah, for sure. So
that's the positive.
So I do want to get that's the positive meaning, and kind of how like aesthetic, how the super kind of the subconscious desires can become real through, not just in a sense of like escapism, but through aesthetic production. And I do want to get more like to the dynamics of Blackstone. But I guess for now, I would like to focus on the humor, that right. dynamic. So yeah, there's obviously an element of fun to the book. I'd say unless you're like someone who's easily offended, it is a very fun book to read, and the kind of dramatic irony in the fiction. I'd say it's dark comedy, it's dark humor. But either both you, Matt, or Dan, do you want to comment on the humor of the book, the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was going through it, it employs a type of humor through dramatic irony that I like to employ in my own writing, that I always like to read, and that is when a character is saying something that, in the context of the novel, the character doesn't realize it's crazy, but the reader knows it comes off as totally outrageous or off the wall, and the author, presumably knows this as well. And so, like, sometimes, like, that can be the funniest type of writing when you're reading. Like, what came to mind is like, well, there's as many passages in Vaporfornia that come to mind, but
can you, if you want to go ahead and name a specific passage, go ahead.
When the black protesters are protesting about how they're taking all of the young black men to the suburbs to enter these boxes for the.
Okay, let's keep it. If you can explain it and keep it like PG-13.
I think that maybe all we need to say is
that's possible.
Is it supposed to be? Are they like Black Lives Matter, or are they more like the Black Manosphere?
Well, I
some
think
kind
that
of
we can
protesters?
cover a lot of this by simply saying that this is the Black Tongues Matter movement.
Okay, that gives our audience a clue, but I don't want to get too graphic.
Yeah, I mean
And it's interesting is it also takes place in Union Square in San Francisco, which currently is having a lot of
Right.
chaos.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, so like when you're reading passages like that and the people are saying things that are just so insane, and you as the reader are just like, this is hilarious. And part of the reason why it's hilarious is the characters don't realize it's insane as they're saying it.
Yeah, with that angle, it was kind of again, like it's hard to talk about without getting too graphic. I want to keep the show somewhat clean, but it was like that whole angle was a parody of these kind of like moral hysterias that I remember from when I was a teenager, with Oprah was talking about these weird sex fetishes, and then it is social commentary. It's also a kind of allegory about social hierarchies and capitalism, how there's anonymous exploitation and then anonymous social hierarchies, and then also a parody of how people will humiliate themselves just to have any role, any social status or role in the hierarchy. So it is very much an allegory. But that aspect of the book, it just seems like it is like so outrageous that it's something that you would never expect to happen in reality. You would never expect to like hear about in reality. So it is kind of like, it is very funny in that
there's
sense.
multiple
It's
levels
so
of satire. I mean, you could kind of have different interpretations of what something like the Black Tongues Matter movement, or later in the book, where avoiding the racial angle, because there's other evidently we learn that what the BTM protesters are protesting is not just something that's happening to black men, but rather that there's an entire exploitative sort of sexual network that we won't touch too much on because this is a family show, but also because we don't want to give too many spoilers. Exactly. But we've had many conversations about this, Robert. There's multiple levels to what exactly is being satirized or explored allegorically in some of these bizarre sexual scenarios that you describe.
Though actually, I did think the same. Not to get graphic, but the same scenario, I did stumble across it reading Naked Lunch, and I wrote this before I read Naked Lunch. But it's this kind of same. It's just like something like totally. It's totally bizarre, and it doesn't make any sense in reality. But it's meant like it is. It's a satire, but then also an allegory about social commentary. Yeah, it's
kind of from this deeply,
And it's industrial. Right. It's like on an industrial scale.
On an industrial scale. Yeah. Let's just say it. But no, it is interesting with Burroughs, and with that notion of the vapor to an extent too. I think these are Burroughs famously wrote that book under the influence of drugs. And there's this notion, and I won't say what your process is, Robert. I won't speculate. But basically that similar to Naked Lunch, it's drawn from sort of the deep recesses of the unconscious mind, wouldn't you say? I think, Robert, in general, I think you have
it does. A lot of, I think, I got this from both books, but a lot of it does. You do have the feeling like you're in a dream.
You, in general, also this ties into your painting. There's something very, hypnagogic might be a little bit of an overused word, but, you're very good at just kind of tapping into this dreamier element of life, the surreal and the bizarre.
Yeah, like what Gio Panicchetti said about how the book and the visual artwork paintings, they complement each other.
You have a real gift for tapping into that, and it comes through in the book, and that's kind of how you end up with these incredibly fecund metaphors and scenarios that I think are deeply open for interpretation on a sort of socio-political or philosophical level.
And then you'd also say the Jenga scene. I have that. That's quoted in the review you did, and if you want to comment on that happened prior to his discovery about like the whole VR, the secrets about the VR, but that part is very interesting, and I've read it on my show with Greg Johnson.
I feel like that part. I just wanted to double back a little bit in terms of the dramatic irony of it all. Dan has, and I will read that section in a moment, Robert, and we'll talk more about that. But I also did want to comment before moving on from the dramatic irony sort of concept here. Dan, your book Nutcranker is not out yet, but I mean, I really do. It's funny because these are two of my closest online friends, but and in so many ways, Nutcranker is very different than Robert's books, but there is kind of a similar use of dramatic irony. Both Robert's book and your book, Dan, have been compared to Confederacy of Dunces, which I also have not read and should. But my understanding is it involves a lot of this dramatic irony. So if you would, Dan, if you want to comment on sort of like the extent to which without giving too much away because the book's not even out, but like, what is that dramatic irony level on which your work is kind of in dialogue with Robert's, if you want to comment on that?
Absolutely. So as I'm reading through Vaporfornia, I will come across passages like the one I just described, but many others, like even just like some of things as banal as Max's observations about everyday life, about like, how he needs to remember to be woke or whatever, and needs to remember to, and it's just like, anyone listening to him, anyone listening to his interior monologue would say, this guy sounds very foolish. This guy sounds very silly. But he himself doesn't realize that. And so...
But does it come across? One thing I was worried about is I didn't want it to sound like a right-winger parroting a woke person. I wanted it to sound authentic. And I actually did. I modified it to take out things that were over the top. But you found it authentic, like the inner dialogue of how a woke person would actually think.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it does sound kind of comical the way he thinks at times, but I think that's good. And I think it's similar in some respects, as Matt noted, to my novel Nutcranker, which is forthcoming this year. And in Nutcranker, the protagonist, Spencer, he has all sorts of grandiose ideas which are, very foolish or very silly when voiced aloud. But they're not voiced aloud. They're things he's thinking. And so the reader reading this realizes that like, this is totally insane. And the author, and probably also understands that the author, knows this is insane as well. But the humor is that the protagonist is bumbling around through the world, believing that his crazy ideas are valid and correct. And, he's making the correct assumptions about the world and the way it works. And so I will draw a through line from that, from Nutcranker to Vaporfornia to Max. And yeah, when he's kind of like trying to like grapple with the way the world works, before meeting Roger, he has a lot of misconceptions, which are pretty hilarious to anyone reading it. And as time goes on, there are all sorts of other instances in the book where characters are saying things like I noted before with the protesters, or all sorts of the instances are too numerous to even really, count, where people are saying things that are, outrageous and very silly, but they don't know that. And we do. And the author does. And so I think sometimes, there's like, it takes a sophisticated reader to understand and appreciate dramatic irony, because you have to understand that the author doesn't fully, the author understands how outrageous it sounds. And that's the point.
For sure.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. I don't know. I mean, do you think there's an extent to which, maybe we'll get more into this later, but is it, we talk about the different way, you know, so you gotten some negative criticism from some people who just like don't get Vaporfornia or don't get Journey to Vapor Island. Robert, do you think there's an extent to where people don't always realize like where you're satirizing or where you're being allegorical? I mean, I do think that's my one.
Oh, the people.
Right. I mean, that's my one gripe.
Yeah, but it's like
Yeah.
I don't really have. Yeah, it's like I think like those people. And I would say this with both like wokeness, political correctness, and then those on the right who are complaining about degeneracy. I just.
Yeah.
I'll just say if it's too degenerate, it's just social satire. But I don't have time to like waste corresponding to
I
those
hear you.
arguments.
I mean, listen, I don't want to start like a flame war here, and I don't think anyone who's like listened to like a half hour into our show is going to even care. But I do think there is, and Jack from the Perfume Nationalist, I think, has done a good job sometimes of also sort of calling us out. I love Frog Twitter. I love, you know, the dissident right, whatever. Like, there's a lot of great people, a lot of underappreciated voices, you know, a lot of great literary voices. But, like, there are these people who sort of lack a sense of humor about any of it, and who, like, in their inability...
Okay, well there was an incident. I'll just say what happened. Is I submitted there's a guy who's sort of in the literary right sphere named Lopez, and I submitted to his literary competition that would be Mencius Moldbug was like Curtis Yarvin was one of the judges, and Lopez did a plug in my new book, and then this other commentary I don't need to say his name is he put forth a screenshot of my original book of something that he considered extremely degenerate, and then Lomas had to take down his plug in my new book, and he told me that he'll review it in the future.
Yeah, see, look, I was going to say don't name names, but I don't look. Lomez, obviously, everyone knows what Passage Prize is. Or most of our listeners know what Passage Prize is. A lot of people probably knew about this when it happened, so I guess there's no point in like being too coy about it. And as you said, it's not that we're like going after Lomez for this, because he clearly put it up without necessarily knowing what he was promoting, and then found out that maybe it wasn't what he thought, which is reasonable enough, and maybe he'll review it in the future. Fine. I'm not here to put him down, and I'm not naming names of anyone else. But I do think that there is a certain faction of people who just, for whatever reason, you can't necessarily appreciate, when something is sort of being satirized, when it's allegorical. And look, your novel, it is pretty dirty in parts, as we've talked about. It's not for everyone, and that's okay. But when it kind of comes down to thinking this stuff is actually, socially filthy or something, and like bad to put out there, that's annoying.
The problem is
they're censorious in the same way that woke people are.
Woke people are insane, but you have the same issue with like these trad alt-right types, where they take, and when it comes to degeneracy, like they take everything literally. Like in some ways, this kind of makes me sound like some more nihilistic, like libertarian type. Which I'm not, but they do say they're mirror images of like
the other thing I wanted to say
in
terms of like where Nutcranker and Journey to Vapor, where Nutcranker and Vaporfornia and Journey to Vapor Island have another strange and awfully specific
Oh yes
is that this had to come up, I have to say. Robert, you obviously don't know this, you're hearing it here first, and perhaps no one that hasn't read Nutcranker knows this. But the protagonist of Nutcranker ends up with a blonde Jewish woman, an Alicia Silverstone type, in Dan's novel, and this is also a type that we find in both Vaporfornia and Journey to Vapor Island. So I don't know what the connection is there, but that's another strange area.
Well, he does have the protagonist has like several different love interests, right? I guess I don't know. Is he a total incel? I don't know. But I guess his first, there's a chapter in My Asian Girlfriend, so he briefly has an Asian girlfriend he meets at City College as a freshman, but they never really, they take a trip to Santa Cruz together, they go to Mount Diablo nearby, near Azaria and Walnut Creek in the Bay Area, but they never really get intimate, and then there's a few other love interests, including Emily Bloom is referenced again. So, and then you make the kind of Mulholland Drive comparison to the girl she's referenced, but Emily Bloom, she's what she symbolizes, and then there's another love interest in there. So yeah, but what were you going to say about Dan's novel, if you want to comment on that?
Oh, just the kind of I would say uncanny coincidence that in both Dan's novel and yours, there's an Alicia Silverstone type who emerges. I don't know if I have much to say on it beyond just that.
It is a type, and I hadn't even thought about it until Matt mentioned it, and he mentioned that those types feature in your book, and there is something to that kind of Jewish Nordic blend, shall we say.
People might interpret like the character Ari Meshel, kind of like the Weinstein-esque like film director. Some people might interpret that as like a kind of like a racist archetype.
To be fair, I'm not exactly up to that part yet, but probably not. The Hollywood film producer who is sexually predatory and what have you, Hollywood is full of a lot of Jewish men, and so that will have a certain, if you are going to characterize and lampoon a sexually predatory film director or film producer, there will probably be some Jewish elements. So no, it doesn't.
Yeah, no, I think that actually not to, rather than moving the conversation into
and then also there's the Emma character too. That's his other love interest,
right? And she's a more positive image than is Meshel. I mean, Robert, I think in general with though
I think she's kind of I guess that seems like that character, Emma the Nature Girl, she's kind of an inside joke. But I think people who follow the podcast, that was a parody of I won't name who he is, but that character was a parody of someone who writes for Tacky Mag and has been a friend of the show.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, no, there's all these different, there's a lot of characters in the novel, and they all correspond to different weird elements of Robert's imagination.
But a lot of inside jokes. That's the one thing. It is a very funny book. But and you can, if you don't understand these references, it's fine. But there are a lot of inside jokes.
There's a lot that goes on sort of below the surface, and you can always kind of go back and find more. But I was gonna say with Meshel, I mean, it's like, yes, some people would interpret that as being possibly anti-Semitic or at least stereotypical. But
the thing is, you actually do see that archetype in mainstream films.
You sure do, because as Dan said, there's a lot of people like that in Hollywood, and some of them are predatory. And kind of like in your novels, and on your Substack, Robert, you're someone who's willing to call a spade a spade. You don't have a specific agenda against any one group of people, but you're also willing to, as we are to an extent too on this podcast, there's a lot of people.
It's satire. I wouldn't say it's not a political dog whistle. It's humor.
Oh yeah, it's not a dog whistle. It's on the nose. It's a satire that is admittedly found in reality, and that we can all sort of laugh a bit about. It's not it's not malicious, shall we say? But before we could.
And I'd say I would add that the kind of same with the racial stuff is I actually did. there was more racial slurs, racial references, and I actually cut back on that because I initially wrote it as American History X in reverse, but I didn't want it to be, because that would sound like a cliche alt-right book. I wanted it to be the political angle to be nuanced and there to be satire. So there are racial jokes, racial references, racial slurs, racial observations, but I didn't want that to be a major focus. I'm sure some people reading it, they may interpret certain things the wrong way, they may not like how their group is represented, but that wasn't the intention. But only as far as explaining some of the class and demographic dynamics in California. not intended to denigrate any particular group.
For sure. I mean, this is probably a cringe in Reddit reference, but I'll make it nonetheless. It's like what they always say, and perhaps still say, about South Park. You know, you are an equal opportunity offender. There's a lot of people on the dissident right who can't make that claim. They really do have their pet hatreds of groups. But in your novels, and also I would say in your novels, which are satirical.
I do. Yeah, it is equal opportunity offender. And like I think, even like the skinheads, the neo-Nazis in the book,
right? Like
I don't give them a flattering portrayal.
No, not at all.
They're also a satire.
Yeah, 100%. But why don't I have this in front of me? So why don't I read?
Okay, so this is the Jenga scene.
Yes.
So I've read this before in the Greg Johnson, but Matt, you go ahead.
I'll go ahead and
read this, and then give your take.
And I'll give my take on it. I think it will kind of lead us into the next level of the conversation. I like this, and it's the lengthiest section that I quote from your book in my Substack review of it, because I think it really does. Like, in this one passage, you could do, like, what they called in college a close reading of it, and you could really touch on almost every theme within the book. But basically, this happens, and I also think it's a really good example, by the way, as what, you know, of a comparison I've often made, that you're not only a writer, Robert, but a painter with words. I think it's a pretty good example of that, too. So this happens in sort of that more futuristic LA that you imagine in the second half of Vaporfornia. Max is in a fictionalized version of what LA natives or people who've spent some time here will know as the Beverly Center.
Beverly Experience.
It is a reimagined mall, and
I guess just to give some background information is like all these malls have been getting these old 80s or even 90s malls have been undergoing these minimalist renovations.
Right. So this would be the opposite kind of renovation, a maximalist renovation, done by Roger
Sort of
Blackstone.
how, like, say, like the original mall kind of kept in the same original direction with the positive dynamics, but then evolved and became like more futuristic. So the mall would, in a sense, be that alternative timeline.
Exactly.
Retro futurism.
Go
ahead.
A lot going on here. Max kind of takes. Well, I don't want to over-explain this, but basically he goes on a bit of a adventure within an adventure within the sort of bowels and sort of back rooms of this mall, and he finds himself in front of, and now I'm quoting, a tall Jenga-like tower made of illuminated cubes of brick glass going way up into the dark sky. The cubes constantly moving and changing color, with the lights turning on and off. From the base of the tower, I walk up a neon-lit stairwell. Looking out, I see the glass cubes floating out into space. As I examine them closer, I notice each one contains a particular memory, some traumatic, some romantic. Some cry out in pain for their missed chance to come into fruition, while others taunt me about the opportunities I missed out on. I try to walk on to one where I see a long-lost crush, but each one just floats away into space. All my missed dreams, the many that didn't come into fruition, each particular moment lost in that state for all eternity, crying out to me as they float away into the abyss. I did this to them for not taking action and giving them a chance to bloom. That's how life works. How if you fail to move on to the next stage in life, you're permanently fucked with no turning back to correct your mistakes and missed opportunities. What Blackstone said about how you have to backtrack in order to get to that path to a better future. So that, to me, it's first and foremost, it's a, it's an aestheticization, it's a visual image, it could even be a painting, you could imagine this as a painting, encapsulating the narrator's psychological state. It's a sort of obsessive, compulsive, perhaps, notion of all of these things in my past, all of these opportunities that I missed, all of these things I could have been, girls I could have been with, other paths that I could have gone on to a more fulfilling life rather than the sort of, incel reality that I found myself in. It's sort of, in the parlance of the incel forums, it's the black pill or the age pill. It's the, it's too late.
Or that quote from, like the incel meme, it's over, or sort of like the Welbeck, that Welbeck, book, whatever,
right?
The infamous like nightclub scene. where one character, he says, you'll forever be haunted by the young lovers you never had.
Exactly. Yes.
That theme. I also say it is even though like the character is only 18 and he's just entering adulthood and finding his way in the world, but it's also relevant to people having like midlife crises and talks of like the geriatric millennials.
Yeah, right. No, it's relevant to a lot of people in that social situation, whether they're incels or just, neets, or people who are variously wake up and they're 30 or they're 40 or they're 50, whatever middle point in their life they're in, they wake up and they find they are not satisfied, that they have not, the world has not lived up to the expectations that they were sort of brought up to have, whether it's a, failure of romantic prospects, professional prospects, whatever. It's that psychological notion of a personal tragedy, of one's personal lost future.
And then it becomes physical and aesthetic.
Yeah, it's physicalized and aestheticized. But also, we're not just talking about personal psychology here. This little section from your book also encapsulates a very political notion. As I write in my review, one thing that you understand as a writer, Robert, and I think this another writer who understands this really well and embodies it is, the person I consider to be pretty much the greatest living author, Michel Houellebecq. There's this understanding that one man's tragedy, one man's sadness, one man's ennui, tapping into that and writing a story about that, that ties into something much broader. Call it the decline of the West if we want to be sort of bombastic and Spenglerian, or these more limited notions like the decline of California. One man's sadness and one man's tragedy ties into this broader sense of decline and these broader social issues. And Robert, I have to say, I think that is in many ways the story of your writing, and in many ways even in the Substacks, that they encapsulate, someone you have your perspective, you have such a unique perspective, Robert, but also you are able to branch out and talk about these larger issues in a very unique way. But to spell it out, more specifically, this notion of lost future, it's both a personal issue, but also the notion of lost future in a political sense.
And then, that's also the other metaphor is Roger Blackstone. His campaign promo also encapsulates that theme, where the couple are driving and then they go back and they make a U-turn. Like, that's also physicalizes the exact same theme.
Yeah, I know you could find recourse into pretty serious sort of traditionalist right thinkers. What's his name, de Benoit, who I've not read that much of, admittedly, or Dugan. There's this notion of like we really have to go back to the root of where all this started to go wrong. There's this sort of radical traditionalist notion of going back.
The politics of retrofuturism. It's different than radical traditionalism of just going back, but maybe about finding the moment, like where you drive back and you miss your wrong turn. Yeah, that's
finding that wrong turn, but then also propel,
and then how to propel from there, and then get to that point. And it's a way to kind of go against like space and time, like to break the rules of the universe.
Yeah.
To do the impossible, and kind of like Blackstone. Yeah, Blackstone's kind of his Prometheism type philosophy is about like doing the impossible.
Doing the impossible, because
but I do want to
it's not simply reactionary. It's going back to go forward. It's nostalgia for a lost future, not a lost past. So that's
exactly.
The rules start to get bent a bit, but the point stands.
Okay, so I do want to talk more about the character's sociological, socio-demographic background, and he is a downwardly mobile, white upper middle class, and it's a different demographic in This is California, but I think it's like a different demographic than like the white working class from the Rust Belt, who were initially attracted to Trump. It is very different.
Yeah.
it's downwardly mobile, but from the white upper middle class. His dad was in tech. So yeah, immense class and status anxiety, culturally very, very sweatable, and in a very much...
Swipple meaning, I always like to spell things out. Swipple meaning, it was an old meme of shit white people like, which is an old blog. Yeah. It basically means your standard...
Maybe a bit dated, but yeah.
Oh, no, it remains fantastic. Swipple meaning the stuff that sort of upper middle class white people like, basically. Your average NPR listener.
Yeah, so really, and also his relationship with whiteness, how... the thought so he is this neurotic, like, white liberal, and how his transformation where he does go from woke to changing his ideology, but kind of skipping like he did.
Mm-hmm.
He's very much like, there is like a legitimacy of identity politics based on personal needs. He never becomes he's not a class reductionist, nor is he like a colorblind like IDW type. He's very much focused on identity politics, but he does make the shift with Blackstone later on. But Matt, you were saying like, yeah, it is a sense like the questions about his wokeness, whether it's legitimately a moral principle or he's just responding to pressure. But you would even say like elite overproduction is a theme.
Oh yeah, I did say that. Like that was something I sort of thought the other day while we were taking notes for this show. You kind of, I think that Max he's definitely a very empathetic person, so I think some of his wokeness comes from he's genuinely concerned with sort of, as I said earlier, access to beauty. He believes that he has some notion of
he
that.
He believes beauty is a human right, but he starts at it from an egalitarian sense. But that's his basis. Like everyone is entitled to beauty as a human right in a leftist sense. But then it kind of exposes him like to Blackstone's campaign, and then issues that are more taboo, very controversial, like including eugenics.
Right. So he kind of goes from someone who wants to increase access to beauty in a liberal, sort of quasi-socialist or Marxist sense about increasing access, and then he later gains a much harder edge about how society should be structured in a way that's hardened. But not to get into that. Also, this notion of is Max. You mentioned that he's a downwardly mobile, sort of upper middle class white in California, and that he kind of falls victim to this notion of elite overproduction, something that the sociological thinker Peter Turchin talks about. And the idea sort of I stumbled across the other day is that sometimes wokeness and performative wokeness, that can be a reaction to elite overproduction. That a lot of his initial apparent liberalism that later gets sort of peeled away as he becomes an unlikely Blackstonian, a lot of that initial stuff is because right now the condition in the United States, and especially in a blue state like California, or a blue city like New York, is in order to establish yourself among the elites, the
true,
culture elite, you have to be the wokest. You
do. But Matt, would you interpret it as a genuine, like a moral principle, or him having white guilt, or you interpret it as Max is trying to like status signal?
I think it's a combination of both. I think his empathy is genuine. So I think that he, justifies some of it to himself in the sense of, I care about people. I want people to be happy. I want them to have access to beauty. But I think if you kind of look a little bit under the surface, he is a white upper middle class individual coming of age in a time when it's really evident that he is not going to necessarily have the status he would have in past generations. He's living in a state with extreme social pressures. An extremely high cost of living, and I think there is this unconscious level on which he's saying, how do I make myself someone who is appealing to the NPR listeners of the world? Because he wants to be what does Max want to be at the beginning? He wants to be a photo blogger, a journalist. He cares about the environment. He really has his sights set on being a member of that liberal elite,
and he's both. He's both moral. He's both high in conscientiousness, but he is thinking a lot about status, because he does have low status.
He has low status,
and he is thinking a lot about that. So yeah, like how I don't want to use, I don't know, the word red pilled is so cliche, I don't want to use it, but how his transformation is, again, like, I decided against the kind of like American history X in reverse. So yeah, a lot of it is just a kind of exposure to the hypocrisy of society, being very cruel and cutthroat, but also gaslighting him about his privilege. And so he does seek social justice for himself, but social justice in a more progressive sense, but then also a birthright for himself in a more rightist sense. So both themes are relevant. And then the idea that we're presented with all these false choices politically, and like how we can live, and how there's a sort of an alternative way to do things. And then these alternative ideas are presented by Roger Blackstone, who is politics, you could say, is almost like a self-satire of my writings, and he's hard to pigeonhole. But you could maybe make comparisons initially to Trump, but perhaps Elon Musk or Andrew Yang. Dan, you were saying that I posted the debate scene previously, and there was a debate scene where the characters actually has evolved since the first book. Roger Blackstone plays a much bigger role than in Journey to Vapor, the Island book. So Dan, do you want to comment specifically on that debate scene, both the humor, but then also the politics of the three different candidates who are running, contrasting?
So yeah, definitely. And that was one of my favorite scenes so far. It not only is it funny, but it elucidates the different perspectives of the three candidates in a way that, casts a real kind of mirror to the society that we live in right now. So David Cohn Rodriguez, he's just like a very much an avatar of the AOC school of neoliberalism. That's how I read it. And the character, the neocon or conservacon character, his name at the moment kind of escaped.
Wilbur Rex Jackson III, the governor
exactly.
of Oklahoma.
And yeah, so the kind of like, he loves free market capitalism, but any thought of protecting workers, any thought of conserving American heritage, obviously is anathema. And the most interesting character to me, perhaps even in this whole novel in Vaporfornia, is Roger Blackstone, because he is this interesting amalgam of, yes, obvious parallels to Trump, but parallels to Ellen as well. Parallels to, Andrew Yang, to great artists, great thinkers. And it's like, in a sense, Vaporfornia is about imagining a future that we could have, and part of that imagining is like imagining, well, who would be the person who gets us there? And like, someone recently asked me, who should be in charge of America if you could snap your fingers and put someone in charge? And it took me by surprise, because I didn't really know who to say.
Before I had people, but there's not actually, I can't name a single person
Yeah,
now.
You imagine
Roger,
one.
Yeah.
I imagine one, yeah. So like with Roger Blackstone, like some people might call him a populist, some people might call him an elite technocrat, a fascist, a socialist libertarian. He could be a Promethean, a futurist, a traditionalist, retrofuturist, a lot of different things to different people. So yeah, obviously people who have read my Substack will recognize the policy proposals, but a bit more satirical. But so
it's.
But yeah, like how would you kind of, if you would just say a radical centrist, like if you had to,
Kind of.
If you saw him on TV, like if you saw him on TV and he was real, like how would you classify him, and how would you imagine his hypothetical political coalitions?
Well, the main problem in politics today, and here maybe I'm getting on a bit of a soapbox, is that no one is willing to tell the truth. And in order to fix most problems, you actually do need to tell the truth. You need to tell the truth about various issues such as race, gender, immigration, and all sorts of other things that people, for the past 60 or 70 years don't want to tell the truth about. And Blackstone, clearly, he doesn't seem to be someone who has animus one way or the other. But he does seem to be someone who is, we before said red-pilled is an overused term, but he is red-pilled. And Wilbur is not. Obviously, Cone Rodriguez is not. And if you are, able to kind of accept and process these difficult truths, then you can enact policy proposals that actually address people's problems. So I took Blackstone to be a sort of Andrew Yang who who never cucked.
Yeah, I could say relevant. It's relevant to what I've called for with the radical center, alt-centrism, is it's a rightist baser understanding of human nature, but offering more progressive solutions. That's how I describe it. And there's more with the meeting when Max actually does meet Blackstone, which was a complaint about my first book, that you never actually show him. You get deeper into the philosophy, but there is. So with Max, so Blackstone, he's hard to pigeonhole, but Max and Blackstone come from different angles, but they end up meeting at the same place. And the appeal is aesthetic, but then also the personal interest. And Blackstone also, he tones down his views to be more palatable to the masses, proposing platinum plans for including African Americans, which that's different, but that little kind of like Trump, but that's different because everyone gets a platinum plan, not just certain groups. Tailoring politics to personal needs, that is something that I actually advocate for, right. And I would like to see in politics, but it is different because you have Jordan Peterson who talks about, it's kind of a bit of a kind of bootstraps mentality, like put your house in order, and you have to put yourself in order before you lecture others on politics. And then the libertarian red-pilled YouTuber Aaron Clarey, he talks about this too, where he has a Clarey test where he judges political figures on whether they're self-made or not. But the politics that I've advocated for in Substack and in this book, the psychology is encouraging people to be very honest and direct. Like, what are their personal needs? Everyone should take their personal interests and put them into a platform, and then everyone debate from there. And a lot of stuff, a lot of motives are subconscious, and people don't understand these subconscious motives, the psychology-driven politics. So I do call for people being very blatant about how politics fits people's personal needs and the need,
right,
and the need to sort of better manage that. So that definitely is a major theme addressed in the book.
It's this kind of definitely a theme addressed in the book, definitely a theme addressed on your Substack. To ground this in the question of who is Roger Blackstone and what does he stand for, it's really hard to define because yes, he's a radical centrist. He's all over the map. He has ideas from every quadrant of the political spectrum. The meme that comes to my head is the sort of Chad centrist versus the Virgin centrist.
Exactly.
And this is a funny meme. If you know the fairly reliable political quadrant test, the Virgin centrist is dots revolving around the very middle. The Chad centrist is where you have the dots of your policy, your ideas. They are all around the extremes of libertarian right, libertarian left, economic right, economic left, etc.
Yeah, because he has elements of a technocrat like Michael Bloomberg, some libertarianism, some alt-right, some left-wing views, some populists. But it is different. It's kind of interesting. Like, Matt, did you see that discussion I was having with some guy on Twitter about where he was speculating like the political alliances. So I think his assessment was like Roger Blackstone would be a coalition of like white populists, the alt-right, lower class POCs, and then upper class whites who voted for Bloomberg.
Yeah, he'd have a big tent following because his views are extremely eclectic. But I think it's more. There's more to it than simply that he takes a wide range of views to appeal to a wide range of people.
Yeah, that's the thing, because that's what I've been advocating for in my articles. It's not radical centrist and just randomly like creating some like salad, tossing some salad, like the right wing and the left wing. It does need core principles to stand upon.
Right, and let me say that I think it can get hard to define. So I don't mean this as the final word on the matter, but I think that it has to do kind of what you said, and it's hard to quite put your finger on. But it's a politics that's founded in sort of meeting people's psychological needs on a deeper level than political ideologies like mere capitalism or mere communism are willing. Those ideologies. They're focused on hyper specific economic, how should things be governed, but you and Blackstone in your novel invite us kind of to a deeper level of like what are these deeper psychological needs that need to be catered to that a lot of politics don't even touch upon.
Well, actually,
I
think the only goods. I think you mentioned so positional goods. Yeah, but that could have aesthetic value, and then that gets so like. I think Yang maybe cucked a bit too much, but Yang is actually the only political figure who did actually address the psychological angle of politics. So yeah. So I actually do think I do applaud Yang for that. He's the only
and he was
candidate.
He was tweeting something good even the other day. Like he's still kind
of
no, he
did. I saw he had a recent video where actually Yang said like, "Why are we beating up on incels? Like if someone's in a bad place of despair." We should be trying to help them. So yeah, I think Yang really is like the only politician really talking about psychological motives and psychological needs and issues. And then also I think like the taboo of the whole eugenics angle, and this kind of gets into like the taboo of people as a commodity. But both Matt and Dan, like what was your take on that angle? And with Blackstone proposing a version of that.
Of eugenics?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, Dan, do you have any hot takes there?
So, I mean, I don't know if there's a take that wouldn't be hot in this particular area. But, I mean, like, it's something that is, obviously very, it makes sense. It's just like, of course, you want more intelligent people to, and more attractive. And increasingly, due to a sort of mating, the attractive and intelligent people are the same. And so, and
Yang actually is interesting, as I think Yang may have said that in the war on normal people.
Yeah, he talks about that.
But then it's interesting because you think of eugenics as like a right-wing social Darwinist view. There's maybe another angle to that is more kind of progressive. Maybe, obviously compare it like with links to the Great Class Swap article, the progressive angle to that, which actually does have historical basis going back to the original progressive movement in the early 20th century.
For sure. Well, listen, I mean, eugenics is not a big area of interest of mine necessarily, and I don't have like this great take on like how it should and shouldn't be applied. But I often, when the topic comes up, I often think of this very brief, I think, article that Adam Parfrey wrote whenever about how eugenics persists to this day under different guises. Call it family planning. Some of these things are sort of euphemisms. The point being that even if we don't have actually a program of selective breeding and blah 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 blah, and even if no one's getting sterilized, there are still
I guess the key point to emphasize, policies
always incentivize some kind of breeding or not.
Policies in general will always select winners and losers, like which groups will go on and pass on their genes, regardless of what system there is. So that's
well. But the interesting thing about today is that the winners today are not passing on their genes. The winners today are increasingly, like, you have many women in their 30s who never have children. And you do have some upper class or upper middle class people who have kids, but they're certainly not having as many kids as lower class people who tend to be people of color, shall we say. And yeah, so the only upper class people who are really having a lot of kids are conservatives. And even then, not a ton, not enough for, to really, replace the upper class. Right. So what's happening is we are approaching some sort of, collapse of sorts. And so in reading this book, like, yes, absolutely, a Roger Blackstone eugenics program is not only, interesting, it, frankly, would be very useful, if not needed.
And yeah, and to kind of clarify, he doesn't even advocate for anything like extreme or inhumane. Like, a lot of it is just talking about like tax incentives.
Yeah,
exactly. So it's like most people wouldn't even call it eugenics, but hey, on this topic,
you could propose something like that and word and present it as like totally humane and palatable.
You could, and because we've reached to it organically in the conversation. I mean, Robert, do you want to give that that really good? I don't even know if you're the original one to say it, but it's a really good soundbite from the Great Class Swap article about the different sections of society. How
I don't have it on me right now.
No, you don't need to quote it.
I think it is the exact same quote is presented by Roger Blackstone in the debate scene.
Right.
So maybe if you have it, if you
I
want
don't
to
have
plug
the quote.
it.
I don't. But it's these are big topics to talk about, but this is kind of a crystal clear encapsulation. The upper class controls too much of the wealth. The lower class controls too much, or not controls. The lower class constitutes too much of the population. These things need to come together. So there's a redistributism of wealth so that people have a higher standard of living, but also we need to incentivize, people with, the upper classes, people with better breeding and of higher education, higher IQ, frankly, to breed more, to be more of the population. Because right now,
yeah, exactly. I would actually. I said it's a thought experiment. I would have liked to see a more, like, a palatable, humane version of that presented. But it is interesting. Like, but the thing is, it's not social Darwinism. I think it would, and if it's done if it's done humanely, obviously. Extreme version of it could be inhumane and totalitarian, but if it's presented the right way, I think in many ways it's actually progressive.
I think in many, many ways it's progressive because no one here is talking about sterilization or anything like that. So the trajectory things are on right now as a society is that the lower economic brackets continue to sort of outbreed the upper economic brackets. So what's happening, the trajectory of the world right now, is that it's the most upper class people are not threatened. They are continuing to breed and be more isolated behind they have their private schools. They're behind the gated their gated communities. These kinds of things are, as I say in my article, they're even more stark in a place like California perhaps than certain other parts of the country. But that's the trajectory of this continuing isolation. The very most wealthy people don't really have to worry about things like population rates because they're always going to have the money to be able to isolate themselves and lead these glorious, luxurious lives. Whilst the lower classes, the lowest classes, continue to breed more and more and more, and just proliferate. And the people who get fucked by that are the former middle class, the people who originally made America great. To hit that Trumpian note, the middle class, broadly speaking, is kind of squeezed out by both of these trends of the upper class sort of isolating themselves more and more, and the lower classes, immigrant classes, out competing them in terms of breeding, in terms of jobs, however you want to put it. So what Blackstone becomes an advocate for that middle class of people, to increase the access to beauty that is currently being isolated more and more to a very highest class. And there's this false noblesse oblige where it's like, oh, but we can bring in immigrants and we're so great for for people of color and all that. That's the sort of false noblesse oblige.
I think like the physical appearance of the population, like it's sort of like there's that like open borders for hotties meme, like it does one hand, it does come across as kind of like fringe, like really cringy, kind of like manosphere type stuff. But at the same time, it is legitimate because classes do select, like a sort of mating does select for beauty, and it does end up having like such a strong impact on society. And then so there's that angle, and the talk about like dysgenics impacting like beauty as much as IQ. There's that angle, and Blackstone actually does want to reverse that, and that's sort of appealing to Max, but who's a bit kind of feels excluded from that. So he's approaching it from that way. But it is interesting, this discussion I was having on Twitter, like who this policies would appeal to. Would it appeal to the middle class, some of the proletariat, some to the wealthy? Like it's really hard to say because, but it would create like really interesting new political coalitions. Possibly some of the wealthy might support it, some of the poor, some of the middle class.
Right.
But it'll create a really interesting political realignment.
Yeah, I think it's a big tent. I can tell you who it wouldn't appeal to, and I think you even touch on this in Vaporfornia. It wouldn't appeal to a certain faction of the upper class, you know, the who would be called the parasitic elite, you know, the people who are framed as the great enemy in a lot of these conversations are people who you know, have their wealth and just absolutely want to hoard it. And want to...
Yeah, I was thinking about that. They benefit from the status quo, but the guy who was put on Twitter I was interacting with, he actually thinks it would appeal to the segment of the wealthy.
Right. I think to the wealthy, it's a question. It's, do you want to be part of a society of a renaissance, of something coming back stronger and greater that is a collective good and a new thriving civilization, or do you want to, you know, buy your private island and bugger off? And I think that is, you know, I don't think that's where it's not communism. It's not, you know, it's not eat the rich at all. It's, you know, let us re-access and redistribute, perhaps where needed, resources to make civilization great again, to thrive again. You know, and if you're wealthy, if you're poor, you can be a part of this. You can buy in. It just requires a certain level of cultural commitment on your part. I think that's kind of the invite of someone like Blackstone.
Yeah, like
on the other hand, or do you want to?
Structures,
and what that's competing against is politics, again, from right, from left, which say, you know, don't worry about that. No, we'll give you your slice of the pie, whether it's welfare or allowing you to, you know, to keep your hoarded wealth. You know, that sort of that smaller politics of appealing to just like sort of this short term politics that you find on the left and the right, where it's just, you know, what signs the next check. That's what so much of politics, both left and right, is. And someone like Blackstone, and some, you know, there was a promise of this in Trump, there was a promise of this in Yang. If Elon Musk ever runs, presumably there'll be a promise of it. You know, where there's this notion that's neither left nor right necessarily of, you know, refounding, you know, something collective and good, you know, that maybe has elements of nationalism, maybe has elements.
And then would you say like we talk about, like the other theme is like pan-enclavism, and does that pan-enclavism or like a rightist version of multiculturalism, and I discussed this with Greg Johnson too, but does that fit into this, or could you interpret that as more as like a controlled balkanization, because Greg is
skeptical?
Yeah, he seems skeptical because he said there would be because everyone would be divided. Like no one could, you couldn't have a nation that would go on and do great things, and that was that would come together to do great things. Everyone would be inwards focused on their own little enclave. So that's a critique of that and like how to make it work. Like one argument is that, is it the least bad of all the options presented? Or is it something that is utopian based upon the true freedom principle, something like pan-enclavism or multiculturalism, right, but a version of multiculturalism where all groups are encouraged to take part and pursue their group interests?
Well, Robert, I mean, you know that this is not to put your idea down at all. I mean, I'm also skeptical of the way something like pan-enclavism would work in effect. I think that, it could just be controlled balkanization. It could just be, a disaster of different groups ending up competing. However, I do think that in your conception of it, you do have something more Blackstonian in mind, where this is a way to, allow different groups to coexist in a way where each can kind of thrive on their own. So, what that would look like, I don't know. It's so far from a social reality at this point that who knows. But I do think that you, in your conception of it, are trying to give it the sort of best blush. What could this look like in the most positive sense?
Yeah, so you emphasize like the true freedom principle, true freedom being able to live in the kind of community society you want to, sort of like even like it's cheesy, but the theme park model, and then also a specialization approach to politics, specialization approaches to economics, education, race relations, and even like almost like a bit of a kind of like flexible caste system, not an oppressive one, but one helping people find their needs. So for it to work, it would need some very positive, progressive vision. It couldn't just be controlled balkanization. I do want to plug. There's an article about my ideas with promoting an alt center from a Swedish site. Most of the points in the article are issues we've already gone over. But if Matt, do you want to pull it up in the chat?
Yeah, I pulled it up. It's by Joachim Anderson.
Yeah, by Joachim Anderson, and the site is called motopol.nu.
Right. Joachim wrote a book for Arctos a few years back that I read called Rising from the Ashes, The Right of the 21st Century. I think that's actually verbatim its title. I'm impressed with myself that I was able to pull that out of my memory. But I guess he's been reading your Substack because he wrote an article in Swedish about. I admit I haven't read the translation of the article yet, but what is the basic upshot there, Robert? He basically, as a sort of dissident rightist or new right figure in Sweden, thinks there's something to this idea. What's his general take?
Yeah, he does. He talks about the different ideas like right wing multiculturalism and the great class swap. So one thing he does add is he opposes it for Europe, but he thinks it's the best solution for somewhere like California. That's one point he makes.
Oh yeah, no, I think that's actually a pretty profound or deceptively, profound. Not deceptively, but it's a good point because Europe. Analyzing the issues as they stand in Europe, which is this place of countries that each in their own right have hundreds and thousands of years of tradition, versus a place like California, which is relatively a new place, a new corner of Western civilization, and that is extremely diverse. And yeah, it's a good point because a lot of your thinking on pan-Africanism is, in fact, you are not talking about Europe at all. You're talking about... It is focused... You're not even talking about the US.
Very much, you could say there's comparisons to ethnopluralism from the European New Right, but it is very much an American, California-centric idea. And I was discussing this with my show I did of Indian Bronson, like with the right and Americanism, there's this sense of loss, and by sort of just being like white Americans being one of many tribes competing for their group interests, to them, they see it. The woke left opposes that for different reasons, but to the right, they feel a sense of loss that they're giving up something great just to become like another minority competing for their group interests. And I focus again on those positive, progressive, and utopian aspects of that as a counterbalance to that. And I will say is, I do predict that way of thinking is the future, but who knows how long it will take.
Yeah, no, you predict the future specifically in California, right?
I would say the future of the West, the United States in general.
Okay, well, not even to split hairs over that. I mean, yeah, it's worth talking about. I guess I feel like we never maybe properly introduced your Substack. I mean, you basically you write about these issues there, and your issues are very rooted, to California. And the way I describe your Substack, Robert, is that I don't necessarily fully agree with everything you say, but are maybe not even necessarily supposed to fully agree with everything you say, because a lot of what you present are thought experiments. But basically, you are trying to kind of think your way through in a way, that would do honor to someone like Blackstone, who has this incredibly eclectic and from totally different premises sort of political agenda. You are trying to think through these problems that California faces that we're not even really supposed to talk about. You're trying to think through them from entirely different angles and come up with novel solutions.
Yeah, like what
that
if
are not
we had?
simply
I was like
take
thinking,
back America.
like what if Collexit happens, but we get someone like DCR, Cohen Rodriguez, and not Blackstone?
Right. Well, and you, Robert, you've been I guess a part of what the California National Party.
Not the Cal National Party. They actually blocked me the other day.
Okay.
But another Collexit organization. Yeah.
You've been a proponent of Collexit. Maybe not the most vicious proponent of it online, but nevertheless a fellow traveler. And I mean, I always in our conversation I've always said, like, why even bother if this happened? The California would just be led by not even like a Bernie Sanders, but like a Dave Cohen Rodriguez.
I think it very well. I mean, I hate to say it, but if it were to happen this year prematurely, that could very well happen.
Right. But I think so too, which is why I've never been that invested in Collexit. However, I think that on your Substack, you're trying to think through. You're trying to kind of adopt politics for California.
An alternative paradigm for California. So politics tailored specifically to the needs and interests of Californians, because the Democrats and Republicans are California parties. So that I do advocate for, but I don't know if Collexit is too much of a gamble. The chance of it actually happening are fairly slim, and if it does happen, well, I had a show with Louis Marinelli, who the co-founder who quit Collexit, and part of the reasons like he left. So I think like the worst elements of the Democratic Party and woke types would seize power. I don't think there's no guarantee it would be a positive
with
endeavor.
regard to California, out of curiosity, have either of you read The Stakes by Michael Anton?
I haven't read it yet, but I mean to. Have you?
Yeah,
Michael Anton being another California native, though he doesn't live there now. But have you read it, Robert?
No, I have not.
So, interestingly enough, I was reading it right before I picked up Vapor Island, and the first 50 to 70 pages, he, a native of California, Michael Anton, uses California as a case study for where the West is headed. And he posits that everything that is wrong with California is a kind of a future vision of what will be wrong with America writ large and the West writ large. So crumbling infrastructure, crippling bureaucracy.
Oh yeah, I think I may. I don't mean to brag, but I think I may have said the exact same point a decade ago.
And so if you can solve California problem, well, you could solve the problem of the West actually.
First of all, I do want to read The Stakes by Michael Anton. And I think, Robert, to go down memory lane yet again, I think on the first show I ever did on your podcast, which was just about me and whatever blog I had at the time, we talked a bit about California, and I think it's a J.G. Ballard quote, and that's also apropos for our podcast, because Ballard is a writer of fiction, who said that the future of the West was going to be the Californication. Actually, no, he didn't. He said the Californization of everything, and then we called it the Californication because we were also talking about the show. But yeah, the Californication of everything, shall we say? So that is, it is. I think it's true. It's a well tried. It's a point that many people have made, and that I think is accurate. In California, again, it's a younger, corner of civilization.
Yeah,
the stuff that happens here.
It does kind of like that's why I don't think Collexit would struggle to work, because it's kind of deracinated and rootless. It doesn't have a grounded, rooted identity. That's why I don't think it's going to work. And
gonna ask
Ask
Robert,
him.
are you gonna run? Are you gonna run for governor of California, Robert?
Okay, so the deadline to file to challenge Newsom is in March, so there's no way I'm making that, and I don't want to pay several thousand and go out and get all the signatures. But I would consider, and I also do feel it's a bit premature. I want to work on more building up a parity. I'll work up on building up a new political paradigm, but I think because of that reason, because California is the future of America, like the person who can propose policy to fix California can fix America, and tailoring political solutions to California. For those reasons, who knows what I'll do in the future? Who knows next election cycle? But I can't really comment on that. And I'll just give my final pitch. Vaporfornia, it's available. There's a link, but on Lulu Publishing. So it's self-published. And my pitch is that it's obviously if you're easily offended, it's not for you. But if you enjoy dark comedy, the dramatized situational humor is for you. If you enjoy the visual, geographic, and aesthetic descriptions, it's for you. If you're interested in specifically in California issues, it's for you. And also, if you enjoy my political articles on Substack and would enjoy experiencing the political themes, but in an entertaining fiction novel and that narrative, then it's for you. So that's my pitch. Go ahead and check it out on Lulu Publishing. And I gotta say, it's been a great show. Thank you so much, Matt Pegas, and also Dan Baltic.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, 100%, Robert. We'll plaster that link, wherever we post this show. And not to co-opt the end here, but we've talked about some pretty heady topics here, but I really want to say, Vaporfornia is a very fun and quick book to, not quick, but it's actually quite long. It's quite a
I think it's about 80,000. Was it 80,000 words or less?
I don't remember the words, but it's about 245. It's longer than my book. Let's put it that. It's a breeze to read. It's very fun. If you see the cover, it's kind of got this cartoonish vibe. The artist is Mark Villard. So
he did Journey to Vapor Island 2, Mark Villard. Yeah,
that comic style matches the tone. It's very funny. I read about this in my blog post as well. There's just so many great little elements here. I'm just going to read, there's an emotional night in a neon 80s dance club on the Santa Cruz boardwalk, a vision of life in the geriatric sprawl of Modesto, California. That's a lot closer to American History X than American Graffiti. There's a freak out in a super Walmart, an abduction near Yosemite National Park, and climactically, and we actually didn't talk about this that much, but maybe it's okay because we don't want to give spoilers. Climactically, there is a Hollywood extravaganza produced by the execrable Ari Meshel, who we spoke about earlier.
Oh yeah, and then you could also say it's like a more sick, twisted version of Sam Hyde's $1 Million Extreme, capitalizing upon
it's sort of like that, capitalizing upon incel culture, and sort of just like in this moment in Mulholland Drive that actually BAP of all people talks about all the time, where you have the Justin Theroux character saying, "This is the girl," and sort of they pick this person to be the star of their show. Our sort of incel, down on his luck protagonist, Max, becomes the highlight of Hollywood extravaganza that is made.
And how they select him, I won't give that away. But they do choose him to be their it guy for their project.
Exactly. They have an ulterior motive, and basically I just want to say that the book starts very introspective. We delved into some of these issues, and it's emotional in parts, but by the end, you are in for quite an extravaganza, and that's pretty much my final word on the matter. Dan, I mean, no worries if not, but do you have anything
it made me laugh out loud, and not every book does that. Actually, very few do. So it has that to recommend it. It is a sort of travelogue of California, and as someone who is relatively ill-traveled in California, it's fun to read, to kind of see the world through Max's eyes.
Yeah, just sort of like how, have you ever seen like the old Seinfeld episodes? Kramer would give his reality show. Someday I will actually like to be a tour guide and give Vaporfornia tours. Or kind of like how we have Papagon on the show. I don't know if Papagon would approve of. I don't know if he would approve of the project or not, but he's giving like Larry David tours, gubernatorial candidate.
Yeah,
like someday I
LA,
actually would like to give Vaporfornia tours in LA, which would actually in LA or the Bay Area or the whole state, including the Sierra part, Modesto part. That might be a bit hard. Though the fictional locations in Beverly Hills or Meshel Studio or the Beverly Experience, that part might be a bit tricky. Well, that part I know. I'll give the tour. People taking the tour will give them VR headsets.
Exactly. Well, that's the alternative. Okay, so there's two possibilities here. One is, Robert, that you get elected governor of California, your book sells a zillion copies. By that point, New Right is as popular as Joe Rogan.
Yeah, let's have that happen,
money and
please.
clout, we could make the tour. Let's have that happen. The alternative is we go, we talked about earlier the negative and the positive side of the vapor. The alternative is that we go the negative side of the vapor, and the whole thing is VR masturbation. Whether we find ourselves, making our dreams into a glorious reality or masturbating behind VR headsets, that reality is not yet solidified. We have time. We have time to manifest our visions. It's an indeterminacy. But let's go forth.
Yeah. Great show, guys.
Good
Again,
close.
thank you so much. Take care and check out Vaporfornia and Lulu Publishing.
Thanks, Robert.
Yes, sir. All right. Take care. Bye.